Tilea's Troubles, Part 105. Once more at Pontremola. A Battle Report. Chapter 1. The Bridge of Pontremola, early spring, 2404. As the Duchess Maria's army progressed to the Bridge of Pontremola, Biagino rode upon his magnificent corpse carroccio, having plenty of time to think. When he was alive, he had fought at the very same bridge during the somewhat unexpected victory of the Holy Army of Viadaza, where he witnessed the Vampire Duke's death at the hands of the hero, General Urbano d'Alessio. Back then, Biagino had been fighting for the living, and while he had waited nervously at the river, his future sire's sire, the Vampire Duke of Miragliano, had presumably made the exact same journey Biagino was currently making, doubtlessly expecting victory in battle. Here and now, however, Biagino was not so sure. He remembered dreaming of that first battle, even before it, for the feeble god Moor had woven many a wretched vision into his slumbers. Those intangible, half-remembered riddles were all that Moor had gifted him, messages so nebulous he only ever seemed to recognise their prophetic nature in retrospect, and even then without conviction. Now, however, he saw, indeed felt, smelt, tasted and heard the world much more clearly, and wielded real powers of consequence. He commanded an entire army of walking corpses, his unholy Church of Nagash. No more mumbling of prayers in the classical tongue, hoping for a smattering of luck to come his way, or for the enemy to feel the slight rebuke of a distant, somnolescent god. Now he could make his bambinos dance, most spritefully and spitefully, several hundreds at a time, and, should they fall to the foe's blades, he could command them to rise again and fight on. He himself had become nimble, strong, and resilient, quite the opposite of the sluggardly creature he had been in life, who ached on every march and winced at every scratch and scrape. Once prey, he was now predator, and most importantly, he had a purpose stronger than he had ever known before, to serve his mistress in every way possible. Yet, despite all this, he was anxious. Pontremola was not at all an auspicious place for vampires. Worse still, he himself had already faced the enemy they were about to engage, in the Trantine necropolis valley of Naroccia, when he had so swiftly recognised the certain defeat awaiting him that he had abandoned nearly his entire army to run away, and for many leagues. As at Naroccia, the enemy was commanded by the Portamajoran Lord Alessio Falcone, an experienced general, capable of mustering grand alliances and renowned for his tactical prowess. They were upon the far side of a river, in the full flow of spring, ensconced in a fortified camp from which they could spew cannon shots, bolts and bullets at their leisure. Their cannons had proved so numerous and powerful in Naroccia that they had torn both his mortis engine and terrorgeist to pieces with their balls of iron before they could even cross the valley floor. Here, also, they had a monstrous, magical construct, the same Titan that had melted an entire company of hex-wraiths at Naroccia. On approaching the Duchess to admit his trepidation, she laughed as soon as she saw the expression on his face, before he even spoke, ordering him to put any and all concerns from his mind. Today, she said, they would break the back of the most powerful army in Tilea, and then tomorrow, so sated that they would surely cry sanguine tears of joy, they would raise that same army up into their own service and conquer the whole peninsula with it. When his frown had lingered a moment longer, she caressed his cheek and said, "They sent an army of cultists to stop me, each and every one dedicated to Moor and entirely careless of their lives. I slaughtered all of them and made them into your toys. Now we can play together. Won't that be so very nice?" There was no arguing with his mistress. And so, surrounded by his flock of followers, he now rode at the far right of the army's line. Maria was with her horse guard, flanked by the Vargeists. Her military lieutenant, the vampire Captain Bernhardt, commanded the 2nd Regiment of Skeletal Horse, out on the far left of the line. At the heart of her army, the mortis engine glided unnaturally forwards, the great weight of its ornate metal and bone carcass borne aloft by a writhing mass of glowing green ethereal spirits. Besides the magical engine loped a large mob of direwolves, and further out, a body of brute zombies bearing clubs, flails and staffs, liberally decorated with skulls and bones, their very skin pierced with osseous shards. And upon the mortis engine's other side, between it and the Duchess, leapt the Vargeists, their leathery wings flapping furiously as their red eyes revealed their greed for blood. Thus was the vanguard deployed. Behind this front line marched 2 further regiments, in the form of zombies and skeletons, between which a corpse cart, simple in comparison to Biagino's majestic transport, trundled along. This was the force that the Duchess Maria brought with her from Urbino, 2 armies bound to her will, and together presenting a mighty army indeed. The army of Portamaggiore and its Riemann allies had marched many leagues to be here. Most felt relief that the enemy had chosen to attack them in their fortified and naturally moated camp, rather than force them to attempt an assault of the formidable walls of Urbino. But some felt happy that at last they could get to grips with the enemy they had travelled so far to reach. Indeed, so many had watched the ignominious defeat of the undead army at Naroccia that they felt less fear than mortals would usually feel when facing such a foe. They had begun their camp further away from the river, but, having been granted the time to do so, had later extended it out until part of its palisaded banks reached the river's edge by the bridge. Yet, when the enemy hove into view, a surge of doubt washed through them, for such a grisly sight compels the living to think of death, and at the very moment when the prospect of battle meant the subject already weighed heavily in their thoughts. To die at the hands of the undead, knowing that one might then be doomed to share their horrible fate, is never something that inspires confidence. Lord Alessio Falcone commanded them, as well as personally leading his armoured foot regiment of men-at-arms, known as the Sea Wolves. Presuming that the enemy must surely concentrate their attack at the bridge itself rather than throw everything they had into the rushing waters, he and his guard defended the barricade erected at its southern end, likely the most important spot in the line. He had a Riemann priest of Moor with him, Father Dardo Bendali, as well as his battle standard bearer. The rest of his field officers were far to his right in the line. Lord Ned Black, his second in command, rode a demigriff with his fearsome hunting pack, while out on the farthest right flank, the Tilean nobleman Marcus Portelli commanded the Black Guard, a large company of mounted men-at-arms. The Knights of the Lady, led by Brother Libero Grossi, a priest of Mamidia, were beside the hunting pack. Next to them, at the heart of the battle line, stood the Colossus, which had once guarded the landward gate of the city of Portamaggiore. His guns, a brace of brass-barrelled cannon, were mounted upon an earthwork bastion, supported by his 2 companies of handgunners. The Riemann Brigade, commanded to man the remainder of the defences, consisted of 2 large bodies of crossbowmen, one being mercenary dwarfs, as well as a small company of skirmishing bravi and the remnant of a regiment of fighting dwarfs. Alessio's own crossbows were placed at the wall behind his mounted men-at-arms. This was the army that awaited Maria. From the front rank of his regiment of sea-wolves, Lord Alessio surveyed the enemy before him. It was clear that they obviously intended to swarm the bridge, to overcome it with weight of numbers, for 2 huge mobs of zombies, clad in the ragged remnants of Disciplinati di More robes, revealing what they had once been, advanced either side of a huge carroccio, directly towards the bridge. From Lord Black's position, the enemy looked very different, taking the form of bony riders, demonic beasts and the mortis engine. He could just make out a woman amongst them, mounted upon a red-barded horse, and realised that she must be the Duchess Maria herself. Good, he thought. Come to me, my lady, and I will help you complete your interrupted journey to death. Not a soldier moved from his allotted place amongst the living. The wizard Hakim, yet to worry about commanding his magnificent contrivance, the Colossus, attempted to conjure a protective spell, and was unsurprised to find the enemy had enough users of magic to sap the winds and prevent his success. Magical manipulations rarely stopped bolts and bullets, however, and just as Hakim accepted his spell was broken, the artillery began to boom. The foremost cannon, at the very tip of the bastion, sent an enchanted round shot deep into the mortis engine, but to no apparent effect. The second cannon, its master gunner seeing the disappointing effect of the other's efforts, chose instead to target the skeletal riders out upon the foe's very far left flank. His shot also hit, but this time with some consequence, for one of the riders shattered into pieces. The gunner did not know it, but the ball had also grazed the vampire Captain Bernhardt on its passage. Bernhardt was caught entirely by surprise by this, only hearing the cannon's report a moment later. The mortar's grenade landed very wide of its mark, and the Dwarfen and Riemann crossbow regiments only felled a handful of zombies. This frail assault by the living, albeit only missile and magic, might have been a welcome surprise, perhaps even an encouragement to many armies. Most of Maria's soldiers, however, were not burdened with such awareness, nor very much in the way of thoughts at all. As one, and entirely regardless of their fortune so far, her personal army and that of the Church of Nagash moved on, with the mounted and monstrous companies nearest to Maria quickly outstripping the rest, so much so that the Vargeist almost reached the river. The massed skeletons and zombies in the rear moved as best they could, while hidden amongst them the necromancer Saphiro now speculated that the battle might well be over before he and the foot soldiers even reached the enemy. The army of the Church of Nagash drew its magical nourishment from Biagino's vampiric will, and being closer to him, nearly half came on much quicker than Maria's own foot soldiers, while the largest regiment was slowed by the need to reform its ranks and files, all the better to cross the bridge. The vampire Duchess conjured magical harms to hurl at the demigryphs, but such was their armour that it had no effect upon them. Exasperated at her failure, she turned instead to heal her captain of his wound, and glad he was of it too. Biagino employed what few wisps of the etheric wind were left to conjure Van Hell's dance macabre on his shambling bambinos, hoping to move them all much closer to the foe than any natural motion could achieve. But the spell collapsed as the enemy's powerful wizard raised up contrary eddies to dissipate its power. Now the crossbows were respanned, the handguns reloaded, the cannons reshotted, and all just as the undead came within range of every weapon the living could bring to bear. The Colossus had not moved for over an hour, standing so still that the necromancer Saphiro had, for a moment at least, entertained the thought that it was indeed merely a statue, until, that is, he sensed the immense power animating it. Now, however, it did move, turning its head to look directly at Maria. It loomed over her, and yet she felt no fear. She knew that compared to the demigryph hunting pack, even such a massive thing could prove easy to kill. She had the harder undertaking on her mind. The wizard Hakim made his way to the other flank of the huge regiment of spearmen, all the better to see the most dangerous foes. What drew his eyes most was the spectral forms of the hex-wraiths, riding beside Maria's knights, and so he conjured Shem's burning gaze to throw at them. Maria must have been distracted, for her counter-magics tumbled chaotically to naught, and 4 of the ghostly riders were removed from the mortal world entirely. This event was not missed by the marksman Lupo the Wolf Lorenzo's keen eyes, who, having kissed his magical arbalest for good luck, sent not less than 3 blessed bolts to finish off the last of the wraiths. When the necromancer Saphiro felt his mistress's momentary distress, he unrolled his dispel scroll in preparation for whatever magic the enemy's powerful wizard would surely conjure on the back of Maria's discomfort. Hakim, however, intended further harm not on Maria, but on the red-winged horrors beside the hounds. When his spell's power dissipated to naught, he cursed, while beside him the Colossus turned its head back to look down upon his master's intended target. Saphiro had sensed that Hakim intended harm on the Vargeists, but then both he and Hakim were surprised, although in somewhat different senses, to see that despite the spell's failure, 2 of the winged creatures were felled by the storm of bolts and bullets issued from the handgunners and crossbowmen on the works. Despite the much more massive mob of wolves loping towards them, they too had known where the real danger lay, and thus their shooting. Out on the far right of the undead lines, Biagino's army of the Church of Nagash had been targeted too. The gunners with the Portamajoran mortar had high hopes their piece would tear great holes in the enemy's lines, but these hopes were dashed, as indeed were they, when their engine shivered, killing them all. The Riemann crossbowmen upon the wall right beside the mortar, however, did not let its explosion distract them, and sent a flurry of bolts sufficiently accurate to slay 4 of the Corpse Carroccho's draft horses. Then, moments later, the dwarven crossbow took down another 3. Meanwhile, the cannoneers knew exactly what they wanted to hurt: the monstrously large mortis engine, gliding at the very centre of the enemy force, as if it were its vile, beating heart. This time, the shots were both deep and damaging, plummeting right through the mortis engine, with such power that the whole construct collapsed in on the cannonball's wakes to be destroyed utterly. For the briefest moment, there was silence, and the engine was gone. Then a radiating wave of light and energy burst out from the spot it had folded into, damaging the Colossus, killing a Myrmidian knight of the Lady, and amongst Maria's force, bringing down 3 direwolves, 1 black knight, 1 skeleton, and 3 zombies. And the last of the Vargeists was entirely obliterated by the shockwave. As they prepared to deliver their charges, Maria's army looked a lot less threatening than it had only moments before.